In the years since the investigation surrounding Jeffrey Epstein captured global attention, thousands of pages of documents have surfaced. Court filings, witness statements, financial records, flight logs. Most of these documents tell a grim but familiar story, one of power, secrecy, and a network that investigators spent years trying to untangle. Journalists combed through them line by line. Lawyers studied them for evidence. Independent researchers downloaded the files and spent months reading through them in search of overlooked details. And for the most part, what they found was exactly what they expected. Legal testimony, names, dates, transactions. But buried among those thousands of pages, some researchers believe they noticed something strange. Not a confession, not a hidden victim statement, but a single reference that didn't seem to belong there at all. Just a word. A label in a document. A small entry that appeared briefly among financial records. So small that it could easily be dismissed as nothing more than a coincidence. At first, most people ignored it. After all, massive investigations often contain confusing fragments, nicknames, abbreviations, code words used internally by investigators or accountants. But a few researchers kept coming back to the same question. Why did that particular word appear in the documents? Because according to some interpretations circulating online, the word looked strangely familiar, not to investigators, but to historians and to people who study ancient religions. The name some researchers believed they recognized was connected to a figure from ancient mythology. A name that appears in religious texts thousands of years old. A name associated with rituals, sacrifice, and one of the most controversial deities in ancient history. Baal. At first, the connection sounded absurd. Surely it was a misunderstanding, a coincidence, a misreading of a document. But the theory didn't disappear. Instead, something strange happened. The more people examined the files, the more questions began to appear. Because once that possibility entered the conversation, some researchers began looking back at something else entirely. Stories. Stories told quietly by people who claimed they had once worked inside Epstein's properties. Stories about late-night gatherings, rooms that staff were not allowed to enter, deliveries that arrived after midnight, candles, symbols, private meetings that nobody ever explained. Most of these accounts were never verified. Some may have been exaggerated. Others may have been misunderstood. But when those stories resurfaced online, alongside speculation about that mysterious entry in the documents, something unexpected happened. A new theory began to spread. Not about occult symbolism, but about something far stranger. A rumor that somewhere, inside one of those properties, someone had witnessed a ritual. Not a ceremony meant to summon something, but one meant to remove something. A ritual with a single name, exorcism. And that rumor would eventually lead people to ask one disturbing question. Was there really an occult clue hidden somewhere in the Epstein files? Or had the internet turned a tiny mystery into something much darker than it ever was? To understand how that theory began, we need to go back to the moment when investigators first started releasing the documents. Because the truth is, those files were never meant to be read by millions of people around the world. But once they were, every word began to matter. The investigation into Jeffrey Epstein generated an enormous amount of documentation. Legal proceedings alone produced thousands of pages. Depositions, court transcripts, financial disclosures, witness testimonies. Investigators from multiple agencies collected information for years, trying to piece together how Epstein operated and who might have been involved. Some of these documents were sealed. Others were eventually released through court orders and legal disputes. When those files finally became public, journalists across the world began studying them. Reporters from major newspapers downloaded the records and began analyzing them. Legal experts reviewed them for evidence that had not previously been discussed. But they weren't the only ones reading. Independent researchers, bloggers, and online investigators also began examining the documents. Entire internet communities formed around analyzing the files. People created spreadsheets, timelines, databases. They mapped connections between names mentioned in testimony, tracked travel records, compared witness statements. The archive was so massive that no single person could read everything, which meant something interesting began to happen. Thousands of people were searching the same documents simultaneously. And when that happens, tiny details that might otherwise go unnoticed sometimes stand out. Someone notices a strange phrase. Another person recognizes a name. A third person finds something that doesn't quite fit. And that's exactly what happened here. Because somewhere within those thousands of pages, a few researchers claimed they had noticed a word that didn't seem to belong. At first, it looked like nothing, a short entry among dozens of others. But the more people discussed it online, the more curiosity it generated. Because once someone suggested what the word might mean, others began looking at it differently. What if it wasn't random? What if it was connected to something older, something symbolic, something hidden in plain sight? Most experts dismiss the idea immediately. Large investigations contain countless confusing fragments. Misinterpretations happen all the time. But on the internet, even a small mystery can grow quickly. And this, one would soon collide with something else entirely. Rumors. Rumors from people who once claimed they had seen strange things inside Epstein's homes. The alleged entry itself was small. So small that many readers never noticed it. But once a few online investigators began discussing it, screenshots of the document began circulating across forums and social media. People zoomed in, highlighted sections, debated the wording. Some insisted the entry had been misunderstood. Others believed it might represent a code name. Financial records often contain internal labels, nicknames for accounts or categories used by accountants. It could have been anything: a project name, a shorthand abbreviation, a clerical note. But the reason the entry attracted attention was simple. A few readers believed the word looked similar to a name associated with ancient mythology. The name of the ancient figure known as Baal. In ancient history, Baal appears in several cultures across the Near East. The name itself roughly translates to Lord or Master. Over centuries, it became associated with various deities worshipped in different regions. In some ancient texts, Baal is described as a powerful storm god. In others, later religious writings portray the name as something far darker. Because of these associations, the name eventually became connected with many occult conspiracy theories. So when a few internet researchers believed they saw a version of that name appearing in a modern financial document, the speculation exploded. Forums filled with debate. Some insisted the connection was ridiculous. Others began looking for patterns. Had the name appeared anywhere else? Was it referenced in other records? Did it appear in emails or financial statements? Most searches turned up nothing, but something else began to surface instead. Old rumors. Stories that had circulated quietly for years about unusual activity inside Epstein's properties. Stories that suddenly seemed far more mysterious once the occult theory entered the conversation. One of the most discussed properties connected to Epstein was the mansion he owned in New York City. The building itself had long been described as one of the largest private residences in Manhattan. Inside were dozens of rooms, multiple floors, and private spaces rarely seen by outsiders. Over the years, several former employees had described working inside the mansion. Most of their accounts focused on normal duties: maintenance, housekeeping, security. But occasionally, some stories mentioned unusual instructions. Rooms that staff were told never to enter. Areas that were suddenly restricted during certain evenings. Deliveries that arrived late at night and were immediately taken to private sections of the house. In many cases, those details could easily have innocent explanations. Wealthy homeowners often maintain strict privacy. Private events require preparation. Security protocols can restrict access. But once the mysterious document entry began circulating online, those stories took on a new life. Internet investigators began collecting every rumor they could find. Old interviews, forum posts, anecdotes from people claiming to know someone who had worked in the mansion. Among those rumors were descriptions of strange decorations appearing during certain private gatherings. Candles placed around rooms. Heavy curtains drawn across windows. Guests being asked to leave certain areas of the house. Most of these accounts remain completely unverified. Some may have been exaggerated or misremembered, but when they were placed alongside speculation about occult symbolism, the internet did what it often does best. It connected the dots, even when those dots might never have been connected in reality. And eventually, those connections would lead to an even stranger claim. A rumor that someone, somewhere, had once witnessed something inside one of Epstein's properties that they could not explain. Something that looked less like a private gathering and more like a ritual. By the time the rumors reached this point, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Online communities had built elaborate timelines. They compared the mysterious entry in the documents with stories about unusual gatherings. They examined photographs of Epstein's properties, particularly one location that would become the center of endless speculation: Little St. James. Images of the island had circulated online for years. Aerial photographs showed several unusual structures. One of them, a small temple-like building, captured the imagination of internet investigators. No one outside a small group of visitors knew exactly what the building had been used for. But that didn't stop the theories. Some claimed it was decorative. Others believed it served a private religious purpose. But when people began connecting those images with the alleged occult entry in the documents, the speculation turned darker. And then, somewhere deep within an obscure online forum, a new claim appeared. The post was anonymous. No evidence. No verifiable identity. Just a short story written by someone who claimed they had once visited an Epstein property years earlier. According to the post, the writer claimed they had overheard something disturbing. A gathering taking place behind closed doors. Voices chanting, candles arranged around a room. And someone claiming the ritual was meant to remove something, not summon it. Remove it. The writer used a single word to describe what they believed had happened: exorcism. The post spread quickly. Within days, it appeared on multiple forums. People debated whether it was a hoax. Others insisted it confirmed what they had suspected all along. But there was one problem. No one could verify where the story came from. No documents mentioned it. No witnesses confirmed it. And yet, once the idea existed, it refused to disappear, because the combination of mysteries surrounding the Epstein investigation had created something powerful. An unanswered question, and unanswered questions often lead to stories that grow far beyond the facts. But the exorcism theory didn't begin with that anonymous post. To understand why the rumor spread so quickly, we have to look at something else entirely: the strange buildings and stories connected to Epstein's private island. Because for many online investigators, that island seemed like the final piece of the puzzle. And what they believed they saw there would only deepen the mystery. Long before the internet began debating the meaning of strange entries in the documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein, there was another location quietly feeding speculation. A place that would eventually become one of the most infamous private properties in modern criminal history. A small island in the Caribbean known as Little St. James. For years, the island existed almost entirely outside the public eye. It was private, heavily guarded, and rarely photographed except from a distance. Visitors arrived by private boat or aircraft, and very few outsiders ever saw what was happening there. To the outside world, it was simply described as a luxury retreat, an isolated paradise owned by a wealthy financier. But once investigators began uncovering the broader network surrounding Epstein, that island became a focal point. Journalists wanted to know what had happened there. Victims began speaking publicly about experiences connected to the island. And suddenly, a place that had once been hidden behind security gates and ocean waves was being studied by millions of people around the world. Satellite imagery began circulating online. Aerial photographs were shared across news articles and discussion forums. People zoomed in on the buildings scattered across the island's hillsides. At first, most viewers saw exactly what they expected: luxury villas, guest houses, swimming pools, helipads. But one structure stood out from the rest. Near the highest point of the island stood a small, unusual building with a dome-shaped roof and white columns. Some journalists described it simply as a decorative temple-style structure. Others speculated it might be a private meditation space or architectural ornament. But once the photographs spread across the internet, speculation exploded. Online investigators began comparing the building's design to religious structures from different cultures. Some claimed it resembled classical temples. Others believed the architecture looked similar to small shrines used in private religious rituals. None of these theories were ever confirmed. Architects later suggested the building may simply have been designed for aesthetic purposes. But on the internet, mystery has a way of growing. Because when people looked at those images alongside the rumors already circulating about the Epstein documents, they began asking new questions. Why build a temple-like structure on a private island? What purpose did it serve? And perhaps most importantly, what actually happened inside it? No official record has ever described the building as a ritual space. But the lack of clear answers allowed speculation to flourish. Online forums filled with theories. Some claimed the structure was purely decorative. Others suggested it was part of an elaborate private sanctuary. But a smaller group believed something else entirely. They began connecting the building to the rumors already circulating about strange gatherings and mysterious symbols. And that connection would eventually lead to a much stranger claim. Because somewhere within those same internet discussions, a story began to appear. A story that would become the foundation of the so-called exorcism theory. The internet has always been a strange place for mysteries. A single anonymous message can appear on a forum one day and spread across the world by the next. And that is exactly how the exorcism rumor seems to have begun. Somewhere, deep within an online discussion thread analyzing Epstein-related documents, a user posted a short message. The account had no history, no verification, no evidence attached, just a story. According to the anonymous writer, they claimed to have once visited a property connected to Epstein years earlier. The post described an evening gathering taking place behind closed doors. Guests had been asked to remain in certain parts of the building while others were escorted elsewhere. The writer claimed that during the night they overheard something unusual. Voices. Multiple voices not speaking normally. Chanting. At first, the writer assumed it was simply a religious ceremony or some type of private ritual. But according to the post, the atmosphere felt tense. Candles have reportedly been placed around the room. Someone was reading from what the writer believed were religious texts. Then the chanting became louder, more intense. The writer claimed they heard someone shouting words they could not understand. And then, suddenly, silence. The message ended with a single line. The writer believed what they had heard that night was an exorcism. There was no proof. No names, no documents. Nothing that investigators could confirm. Yet the story spread quickly. Within hours, screenshots of the post were appearing on multiple forums. YouTube videos began referencing it. Blogs wrote articles analyzing the claim. But the reason the rumor spread so fast was not the story itself. It was the context surrounding it. By the time the anonymous post appeared, people were already debating the mysterious document entry some believed referenced Baal. They were already examining photographs of the temple-like building on the island. They were already discussing rumors about strange gatherings inside Epstein's properties. So when the word exorcism entered the conversation, it seemed to fit. Not because it had been proven, but because it connected several existing mysteries into one narrative. And once that narrative formed, it proved incredibly difficult to stop, because the more people discussed it, the more details they began adding. And eventually the conversation shifted from the rumor itself to something older, something ancient, a name that had existed for thousands of years, a name that would become central to the entire theory. The name that captured the internet's attention was Baal. In ancient history, Baal appears in the mythology of several Near Eastern cultures. The name itself roughly translates to Lord or Master. In early texts, Baal was often associated with storms, fertility, and agricultural cycles. Entire civilizations built temples dedicated to deities bearing the name. Over centuries, however, the meaning of the name began to shift. In later religious writings, particularly those from cultures that opposed Baal worship, the name was portrayed differently. Instead of a respected deity, Baal became associated with forbidden practices and idolatry. Some texts described rituals performed in his honor. Others portrayed Baal as a symbol of moral corruption or spiritual darkness. Because of these historical references, the name gradually became connected to occult traditions in modern conspiracy theories. Books, films, and internet forums frequently reference Baal when discussing secret rituals or hidden religious practices. But historians emphasize that these interpretations are often exaggerated. The ancient worship of Baal varied greatly between cultures, and many stories surrounding the name have been reshaped by centuries of religious conflict and myth-making. Still, once the name appeared in discussions about the Epstein documents, it captured the imagination of online investigators. Because in the world of conspiracy theories, symbolism can be incredibly powerful. People began searching for connections everywhere. Architecture, artwork, language, any small detail that might hint at something hidden beneath the surface. And that's when the rumors began to evolve again. Some theorists suggested that if occult symbolism really had existed within Epstein's circle, then perhaps the alleged ritual described in the anonymous post had been an attempt to counteract it. Not a summoning ritual, but something meant to reverse or remove a spiritual influence. An exorcism. Again, there was no evidence, no witness testimony confirming such an event. But the theory had taken hold. And like many internet mysteries, it began spreading far beyond the original discussion forums. YouTube channels analyzed it, podcasts debated it, articles attempted to separate fact from speculation. Yet, despite all the attention, the core mystery remained the same. No one could prove where the rumor came from, and no document in the Epstein investigation ever confirmed it. But that uncertainty may have been exactly what kept the story alive. Because sometimes the most powerful mysteries are the ones that exist somewhere between fact and imagination. By the time the exorcism theory reached mainstream discussion, the original source had almost been forgotten. The anonymous post had disappeared. The account that wrote it was never identified. Yet, the story continued to circulate. Not because it had been proven true, but because it existed within a case already filled with unanswered questions. The investigation into Jeffrey Epstein left behind a complicated legacy. Thousands of documents, multiple court cases, years of testimony. And even after all of that information became public, many aspects of the story remained unclear. Who knew what? When did they know it? And how much of the truth had never been recorded in official files? These unanswered questions created the perfect environment for rumors, because when people feel that a story is incomplete, they naturally try to fill the gaps, sometimes with research, sometimes with myth. The exorcism theory appears to be one of those myths, a story that grew from a combination of real documents, misunderstood references, architectural mysteries, and anonymous internet claims. There is no verified evidence that an exorcism ever took place at any Epstein property. No official record describes such an event. No witness testimony confirms it. Yet the rumor continues to circulate because the elements that inspired it are real. The island exists. The documents exist. The mysterious building exists. And somewhere within those thousands of pages of records, a small, unexplained entry still sparks curiosity among researchers. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was misinterpreted. Or maybe it was simply a clerical label that meant nothing at all. But once the internet began connecting those fragments together, the story took on a life of its own. And today, the theory remains one of the strangest rumors ever connected to the Epstein investigation. Not because it has been proven, but because it exists in the space where mysteries live. The space between what we know and what we imagine might be true. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the story. Because sometimes the most disturbing theories aren't the ones that are confirmed. They're the ones that remain forever unanswered. Stories built from fragments. Rumors born from silence. Questions that never quite disappear. And in the end, the real mystery may not be whether an occult clue ever existed in the Epstein files. The real mystery may be something much simpler. Did the documents truly contain something strange? Or did the internet transform an ordinary detail into one of the darkest legends surrounding the case? Because once a story like this begins, it rarely ends. It simply waits for the next person to open the files and start asking questions again.